thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. We have 30 minutes to discuss energy security and supply, so let's just get straight to it. Minister, I'm actually going to start with you. To what extent are these soaring prices of energy, of oil and gas, to do with short-term, so COVID, the war in Ukraine, and how much of it is underinvestment in the last decades, and governments talking about the transition without being fully prepared for it?
First, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think if you look at oil prices and what's happening today, you have to go back about 7 or 8 years and look at the almost 20% year-on-year reduction in capital expenditure in the upstream business, whether it's oil or gas, for years. And then you had the COVID situation and what happened with the overall slowdown worldwide of basically transportation and people moving with all the quarantines and all that happened. And then it was amplified even more by what's going on in the Ukraine. So the underinvestment is the underpinning reason really for much higher prices. And over the top of all that, if you look at what happened in all the governments and the rhetoric before the COP26 on energy transition and demonizing oil and gas companies, that also was a big reason. So there's, for it to correct itself, it needs a lot of investment.
So, Darren Woods, I mean, how should the oil and gas companies, how should countries now respond to this?
Well, I'd agree with His Excellency's assessment of how we found ourselves in this position, and I think how we move past this position is, I would say, a more thoughtful process around striking the balance between not only the development of oil and gas and the role that it plays in advancing prosperity, empowering economies, while at the same time making investments in the things that are going to reduce emissions. Carbon capture and storage, I think, is something people are talking a lot more about, which are going to play a critical role as we advance our ambitions to lower emissions, hydrogen, biofuels. And so I think thoughtful conversations about investments across that whole portfolio of solution sets needed to provide affordable and reliable energy while reducing emissions is the path forward.
Kuwait is the 4th biggest producer also in OPEC. Can OPEC members actually make up for some of the lost production?
Sure. First of all, as His Excellency said, I'm honored to be here in this panel. I'm extremely honored to have His Highness attend this panel as well. In terms of OPEC countries or producing countries, we're committed, as Kuwait, we're committed to make the investments necessary to ensure that we can meet the increasing demand on hydrocarbons going into the future. Anytime you look at an energy transition, you have to recognize, first of all, that it is a transition and not a switch. And I think that's one of the, in addition to everything that His Excellency mentioned about underinvestment that happened 70 years ago. As you know, typically the world discovers about 6 billion barrels of oil a year. The massive underinvestment that started in 2014 and 15 and continued led to discovery of less than 2 billion barrels of oil a year. That's a third. And the typical investment cycle for exploration is 7 years from the time you discover oil until you can bring it onto market. Strangely enough, that is now exactly 7 years after that underinvestment happened. What we're doing instead, though, in Kuwait is we have increased our exploration, we have increased our investments in building capacity to meet the requirements of the future. For example, we are now, after about 80 some years of producing oil and gas onshore Kuwait, we've now taken the first step into exploration offshore. We've never touched the offshore in Kuwait, but now the first offshore drill rig arrived in Kuwait a week ago and will spud soon.
Mr. Woods, first of all, how damaging is it to be attacked by the U.S. president saying you're making more money than God?
Well, we tend to look past a lot of the political rhetoric that we see day in and day out and think through the fundamentals. That's been, I think, the approach the company has taken for my whole career. And I think as you think about the future and the long investment cycles that were just mentioned, you've got to be thinking through not just today and tomorrow or the next year or the next administration, but through this very long time horizon. and stay focused on the things that are changing, the things that you need to do to contribute to the broader societal needs.
So what does it mean for your investments in the U.S. in terms of also CapEx spending that are still lower to pre-pandemic levels? And we have some of your rivals saying, look, they'll never be able, because of some of the ESG pressures, to build a new refinery or even increase refinery capacity in the U.S.
So we're one of the few companies in the U.S. that are actually investing in refining. We've got a big expansion that we're working on, a 250,000 barrel a day expansion, which is the equivalent of about a new refinery in the U.S. And the work that we did starting back in 2017 had this understanding that we were going to continue to need oil and gas, and so started a fairly aggressive investment program with a lot of upfront investment, particularly in the unconventional space. We took a very different approach, front-loaded the investments, and we're now realizing the benefits of that. And so last year, our unconventional oil production in the U.S. grew by 25%. We expect to grow 25% this year. And so the investment plan that we laid out 5 years ago is the plan that we're currently on. And the pipeline of projects that we have are continuing. They're very robust. They're advantaged versus the rest of industry, and I think robust to whatever policy comes out. And we're driving emissions down. So our view is you can do both. It's not an either-or equation. It's an and equation. We're lowering emissions and continuing to invest, which I think meets the needs of the U.S.
But Minister, I guess in the shorter term, I don't know how we stabilize prices. I know you were talking about, for example, the price of gas and the fact that we're starting to see demand destruction. So how do you see this equilibrium?
I think, as mentioned by my colleagues here, we need to invest more in the oil and gas sector. And I think what's happening today, due to the better revenues that all the oil and gas companies are getting, also due to, I think, legislators understanding that you can't do transition without having the base load covered, which is having investments in the gas business. If you look at what we're doing in Qatar, we started in 2017 to embark on the largest LNG expansion in the world, and we're going to be increasing our production from 77 to 126 million tons per annum by 2026, which will help greatly the requirement of gas around the world. But when we do that, as mentioned by Darren, you can do it responsibly. We've been sequestering gas in Qatar. People are talking about CO2 sequestration as a very important element of expanding our business in the energy sector while preserving the environment. We started injecting in 2015 2.5 million tons per annum of CO2 in Qatar, and it's been going on for the last 7 years. And going forward, we're going to be also injecting up to 11 million tons of CO2 sequestration. We're going to be using solar to power some of the LNG. All the LNG ships that we're doing have no heavy fuels, and they're all going to be powered by LNG. So I think you can do the same requirement of energy transition responsibly, but being realistic and practical about what you need done.
Which means, Minister, that it will take longer to go through the transition?
No, it means it's more responsible. If you look at what they were talking about on transition and everybody pushing towards transition, today as we speak is the highest utilization of coal ever. Today. And 30% of the power used by coal around the world is powering different plants. And funny enough, I mean, some of the coal power plants are used to make wind turbines and solar panels in factories. So when you look at it, and we need to get rid of coal, and we need to be more responsible in what we do in developing oil and gas as an industry, and we're doing that.
Has Europe asked for more energy from Kuwait? Has Europe asked for more energy from Kuwait?
Well, we are supplying everybody. We are supplying all of our customers as they requested. We're not seeing a huge demand increase on our energy because typically our customers have been our customers for decades,
right.
And not much has changed in terms of their requirements, except that they continue to increase over time. But we haven't seen that big switch yet because refineries are built typically for a certain type of crude. So our crude tends to go to certain types of refineries, and while oil is a commodity, it's still not the same quality of crude that goes into any refinery. But in terms of capacity build out, and I know this was mentioned just a couple minutes ago, we are and Darren mentioned this in terms of refining. We are in the commissioning stages right now of a new refinery in Kuwait. It will be the largest refinery in the world at 615,000 barrels of oil a day capacity. That should be online by the end of the year, assuming everything works out well, and that will supply the product that you're asking about in terms of increased demand from Europe and other places. It's not so much that the demand is coming in terms of crude, but it's coming in terms of product, and that will provide that product.
Kuwait, I think, pumped some 2.7 million barrels a day last month. Can you go higher than that?
We are under the OPEC allocation right now. We're at 2.768, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. We can go higher than that, and we have the plans in place right now to ensure that we can continue to match whatever increases are going to be required over the future.
I'm going to ask you all the dreaded oil price question that I know is impossible to forecast. What dynamics are you seeing in the next 12 to 18 months? Is there a price or a range where it stabilizes?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to predict prices other than what I'd say is general trends. And I'd go back to the comments you asked at the beginning, which is what was the seeds that caused where we're at today, which is the underinvestment. I would say the pandemic really sucked a lot of the investment out of the industry simply because there wasn't the revenues to make those investments. And after we came out of the pandemic, as we were going through 2021, many of the international oil companies were rebuilding the balance sheet and paying off the debt they had to borrow to just make it through 2020. And so there's really been a 2-year significant reduction in investment. In the meantime, we continue to deplete the fields that we were producing. And so I think catching up on those investments are going to take some time. And so you're going to have, I think...
Time, 5 years?
So I think so you think two lost years of productivity on top of the reduction. So to respond to that effectively, you're probably looking at 3 to 5 years of continued fairly tight markets. How that manifests itself in price obviously would be a big function of demand, which is difficult to predict.
If I may maybe speak on behalf of some of the international companies and what some of the governments are doing, you see a lot of discussion around the world about governments saying that we're going to tax oil companies and windfall tax, as they call it, so that because they're making too much profit. I don't see the governments coming to pitch in when they were losing money and borrowing when the oil price was negative in Texas. So I think you have to take a longer-term approach, and I think for the industry to survive, I think when they make large sums of money, they need to have that money to be able to invest for the future. But if every time there is a windfall profit, as they call it, or a higher margin for oil and gas companies, and then we tax them and try to take money away as much as possible from them, then you can't ask them in turn to invest. It's just a comment, I think.
I think on that point there is also an important and quite dangerous trend that is happening recently, and that is a question not just of security of supply that countries always look at from an importing basis, but from security of demand for us as exporting countries. Because the investments that are required to maintain the type of production that is required to power the world are long-term investments. Now, we as national oil companies are making those investments. You're seeing that in Qatar, you're seeing that in Kuwait. The flip side of that, however, is that we are seeing from consumers saying, please give us more energy now, but we do not want your energy in a few years' time. And that is a paradox here that is causing quite a tremendous disruption in the investment cycle, because we're making those long-term investments, but not international oil companies, not all of them, let's say. Quite a few of them have publicly announced that they will only make short-cycle investments. Now, those short-cycle investments will add a few barrels of production, but they won't be enough to cater for the increased demand that we see happening over time. And for example, just to use a statistic, right now the world is producing and consuming about 100 million barrels a day of oil. But what we forget is that there's a natural decline in oil production from existing oil wells. Not all of them are declining at this point, But let's say that about half of them in non-OPEC production is declining. Decline rates are about 3 to 5% a year. So you're talking about a decline rate of existing fields somewhere between 2.5 to 3.5 million barrels of oil per year. And that is the production of Kuwait. So you're going to have to replace the state of Kuwait every single year going forward. What kind of investment does that require? And are companies willing to make that investment? And are consuming countries willing to ensure that they will continue to receive those hydrocarbons, albeit abated for carbon, but will that security of demand remain?
Darren Woods, the minister took a shot at some of the policies that some of the governments are putting in place in certain parts of the world. Do you worry about what could be perceived as knee-jerk reactions, so either a windfall tax or even stopping U.S. oil from being exported?
Yeah, I think, well, policy obviously plays a very important role given the long-term nature of the business and the investment environment that all of our companies face in terms of making billion-dollar decisions over a time horizon, which typically exceeds most political time horizons. So I think we've got to expect some of the knee-jerk reactions because politicians are rightfully looking for solutions to some very real problems. And I think the challenge here is making sure that we're keeping a dialogue open to strike that balance and to recognize that decisions you make today will have significant impacts with time. And my one hope is, as we've experienced some of these challenges here of late, that there's a recognition that those challenges didn't come to be based on the current circumstances, but instead were a result of decisions made 5 to 7 years ago. And as we think about going forward, to be very conscientious about the decisions you make today and the impact it will have to 5 to 7. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot of volatility and discontinuities in the marketplace if we don't get to more thoughtful policies.
So I think you're meeting Secretary Granholm this week. What's your pitch?
Our company is, yes.
Okay, what's the company's pitch to fix U.S. gasoline prices?
Well, we've had an ongoing dialogue with the administration around the importance of regulation, legislation to try to drive, on the one hand, a more efficient investment process, a desire to have a better tone and a recognition for the balance that needs to be struck going forward. And I think the recognition that while we're doing that, to put the proper regulations and legislation in place to incentivize decarbonization steps. Carbon capture and storage is a great one for the U.S. given its endowment of sequestration. And so trying to, again, advance policies on both sides. One, to advance and make more efficient and effective oil and gas investments, while at the same time doing it for climate and emissions reduction.
Minister, you're also getting foreign companies involved in the biggest gas project in the world. I think you signed deals with Total, Eni, Conoco. Exxon is just here. Can we expect any?
Maybe as a sneak preview, if you will, we're going to be signing this afternoon. And Exxon is definitely a very important strategic partner, and they will be part of the North Field expansion. So we're going to be signing it this afternoon.
I love a bit of breaking news on a panel. Any more coming after that? We're actually also running out of time.
Yeah.
So how much volatility can we expect for gas prices, for oil prices? And again, what does it take for those, not the price, but just the volatility to subside a bit?
The volatility is very much tied with the shrinking spare capacity that's going on in the world. So the more we're asked to increase production, the less spare capacity is going to be available, and that will, in turn, increase the volatility. But there's one thing that I just want to leave with. In terms of carbon, and carbon capture certainly is one of the issues that is most important. But the point here is, in any transition, any energy transition, there will always be a place for oil. The question then is, whose oil is it going to be? We sit on the low end of the cost curve, both in terms of cash cost and carbon cost and carbon intensity. We're the lowest in the world in Kuwait, but we need to stay there. And as the fields age and mature, we need to ensure that the investment is there to keep us where we need to be. That requires partnerships with international oil companies, with everybody, with research communities, and it cannot be a war against fossil fuel. It has to be a partnership to reduce the carbon intensity of fossil fuels, to ensure that they remain a vital part of the energy transition.
Minister, on volatility, you have about 20, 30 seconds each because we're running out of time. But when are you expecting the volatility and prices to stabilize?
I think what Darren said is quite accurate, and I think there's going to be a range, that we will see, and it will take time for us to fix the problem. But the legislators have to be on board. Everybody has to be fighting the same battle, if you will, so that we can get to a safe landing. And this, but it's going to take time, and we have to be practical about the expectations on transition.
Darren Woods?
Well, I think I'd make a distinction between what I would say is the fundamental tightness in supply and demand, which will be elevated prices, and then volatility, which I think are going to be driven more by episodic demand increases or supply decreases. And then I would also say, depending on how policy evolves, aspirational policy that's disconnected from some of the practical realities of what was required to transition. As we said, it's not a switch, it is a transition. If those policies are not thoughtful, you will see discontinuities and disconnects in the market, which will lead to even more volatility. So I think keep those two things in separate.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.